You've heard of Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, names that echo through every history textbook, but you've probably never heard of DeWitt Clinton. And that's a problem, because while presidents were giving speeches, Clinton was drawing lines on a map that would decide which American cities would explode into power and which would wither into forgotten towns. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even particularly charismatic. He was a canal planner, and in 1817, he convinced New York to dig a ditch 363 miles long through wilderness that most people thought was worthless. They called it Clinton's Folly. They laughed at him. 8 years later, the Erie Canal opened, and overnight, New York City became the most important port in America. Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, cities that didn't really exist, suddenly mattered. All because one man decided where the water would flow. Here's what they don't teach you. Empires don't start with speeches. They start with boring drawings and muddy work sites. Think about that. A guy with a surveying tool and a budget literally decided the economic future of millions of people who hadn't even been born yet. No election, no public vote, just engineering. And here's the uncomfortable question. Why didn't you learn his name in school? Maybe because if you knew how much power these nobodies had, you'd start asking who's quietly drawing the maps today. Let me show you something. Pull up a map of American cities. Look at the pattern. Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, they're not where they are by accident. They're sitting on the bones of decisions made by engineers and surveyors you've never heard of. Men who looked at rivers, mountain passes, and railroad routes and said, this is where the nation will flow. The 1850s, America is expanding west, and everyone thinks it's about manifest destiny and pioneer spirit. Beautiful story. Wrong focus. The real story? It's Theodore Judah, a railroad engineer obsessed with finding a pass through the Sierra Nevada. He spent years in the mountains, getting laughed at by investors, sleeping in mining camps, mapping routes that everyone said were impossible, and then he found it. Donner Pass. He convinced 4 Sacramento shopkeepers to fund his dream. You might have heard of them later. Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, Crocker, the Big Four. They got rich. They got famous. Judah died broke and forgotten at age 37. But here's what matters. Judah's route became the Transcontinental Railroad, and that railroad decided which towns would boom, which regions would starve, which resources could be extracted, and which couldn't. One man's technical choice, a century of consequences. You're living inside those consequences right now. The highway near your house, the freight routes that determine what's cheap and what's expensive in your grocery store, they're echoes of decisions made by engineers 150 years ago. Status quo isn't natural. Somebody designed it. And here's the pattern you need to see. These architects got none of the glory, but all of the blame when things went wrong. When railroads cut through indigenous land, when towns died because the tracks went elsewhere, when farmers got gouged by monopoly pricing, nobody blamed the Big Four. They blamed the engineers, the surveyors, the technical guys. The people with actual power stayed clean. So let me ask you directly, when you look at America today, do you see the presidents or do you see the infrastructure underneath them? Because I'm about to show you that the infrastructure people, the ones you never see, have always had more leverage than the names in the history books. And it gets so much bigger from here. Once the skeleton of canals and rails was laid down, a new kind of architect arrived. The ones who realized you didn't need to just build one piece of track. You could own the entire system. Andrew Carnegie didn't just make steel. He owned the iron mines, the ships that transported the ore, the railroads that moved it, the factories that turned it into steel, and the distribution networks that sold it, every single step. When you control the supply chain, you don't compete in the market. You are the market. And if that sounds like today's tech platforms, Amazon controlling retail, logistics, and cloud computing, Apple controlling hardware, software, and the App Store, you're not wrong. The playbook is 150 years old. John D. Rockefeller took it even further. Standard Oil didn't just refine petroleum. It controlled the pipelines, the railroad contracts, the storage facilities. Rockefeller would go to railroad companies and say, give me a secret rebate or I'll build my own railroad. And they did. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining, not through better products, through better system design. Ask yourself, if you controlled steel, oil, rail, and money in 1900, did you need a ballot box to rule? Because here's where it gets really interesting. 1907, financial panic. Banks are failing, markets are collapsing, and the U.S. government has no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no way to stabilize the system. So who stops the panic? J.P. Morgan, a private banker. He locks the most powerful financiers in his library and refuses to let them leave until they agree to pool their money and save certain banks. He decides which institutions live and which die. In his mansion, over cigars. One man acting like a private central bank. Were they saviors of efficiency or legalized monopolists? Heroes or villains? The answer is both. And that ambiguity is the point. Carnegie gave away libraries. Rockefeller funded medicine. Morgan saved the economy. And all three of them rigged the game so thoroughly that it took decades of antitrust law to even start unwinding their power. Here's the question nobody wants you to ask. When one person can crash or save markets with a telegram, who really governs? And if you think this kind of power grab ended with the Gilded Age, wait until you see what the bureaucrats did. Because private empire is one thing, but imagine if someone figured out how to encode that power into the structure of government itself. Permanently. That's next. When you hear the word bureaucrat, you think of red tape, paperwork, DMV lines, boring stuff. But the people who designed the census, the tax code, the regulatory maps of energy, banking, and transport, they weren't just shuffling papers. They were building the operating system of American power. Here's what I mean. The 1890 census. The U.S. population had grown so large that the Census Bureau realized they couldn't count everyone by hand anymore. So they hired an engineer named Herman Hollerith. Now, Hollerith invented a machine that used punch cards to tabulate data. Sounds small, but that machine didn't just count people. It standardized how the government saw its population. Who counted? What categories mattered? How data flowed? Hollerith's company eventually became IBM, and those punch cards became the foundation of modern computing. One bureaucratic tool became an empire. But here's the deeper thing. Once you can measure something, you can tax it, regulate it, weaponize it. Think about it. Why is it easier for the state to track your income than your health? Why does the IRS know more about you than your doctor? Because someone, decades ago, drew a line deciding which data mattered and which didn't. They built the form, and the form shapes reality. This accelerates during World War I and World War II. The federal government explodes in size. Agencies for food, fuel, production, labor, and they don't disappear after the war's end. They just stay. The people running them aren't elected. They're civil servants, experts, engineers of the federal machine. And they have something elected officials don't have: institutional memory. They're there before the president arrives. They're there after the president leaves. Presidents come and go. The org chart stays. Take someone like Vannevar Bush. You've probably never heard of him. During World War II, he ran the Office of Scientific Research and Development. He coordinated the Manhattan Project, radar development, and countless other innovations. After the war, he wrote a report called Science, the Endless Frontier. That one report created the framework for how the U.S. government funds science. It led to the National Science Foundation, DARPA, the entire post-war research apparatus. Bush never held elected office, but his memo shaped 70 years of policy. You don't exist to the state as a person. You exist as a line in a table someone like this designed. And here's the thing that should make you uneasy. These systems are legible only to the people who built them. If you don't understand how the tax code works, how regulatory agencies operate, how federal statistics are compiled, you can't challenge them. You can't even see them. You just live inside them, like a fish in water, never noticing the water. Why is this invisible to most people? Because we're taught that power looks like politicians on TV. But that's theater. The real power is in the systems that politicians have to operate within, the rules they inherit, the agencies they can't dismantle, the data they don't control. And just when you think you understand where the levers are, the game changes again. Thinkers, strategists, people who lived in the world of ideas and scenarios. And they built something even more invisible than regulatory agencies. They built the doctrine. By 1945, American power wasn't just about factories and railroads. It was about equations, war games, and policy memos written in rooms you will never enter. Let me introduce you to RAND Corporation, founded in 1948 as a think tank to advise the Air Force. They hired mathematicians, physicists, economists, political scientists, people like Herman Kahn, who gamed out nuclear war scenarios, John Nash, who developed game theory, Albert Wohlstetter, who shaped Cold War nuclear strategy. These weren't politicians, they were theorists, and their job was to model the future, to run simulations, to answer questions like, if the Soviets launch, what do we do? How do we contain communism without triggering World War III? What does deterrence actually require? And here's the key. Their answers became doctrine. Mutually assured destruction, containment, flexible response. Détente. These weren't slogans. They were intellectual products, workshopped in think tanks, sold to policymakers, encoded into military strategy. When did you vote for the doctrine that shaped the last 50 years of foreign policy? You didn't, but someone in a windowless room workshopped it, modeled it, sold it, over coffee and charts. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's how the system works. Policy is rehearsed long before you see it, and the people rehearsing it aren't usually the ones on camera. Think about the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the meeting that created the World Bank, the IMF, the post-war economic order. Who designed that system? Not Roosevelt, not Churchill. Economists, especially John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White. Two technocrats in a room sketching the financial architecture that would dominate the world for 80 years. They decided how currencies would relate to each other, how debt would flow, how development would be funded. Small circle, massive consequences. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Many of these think tanks are still around. RAND, Brookings, Council on Foreign Relations, Heritage Foundation, Center for a New American Security, same networks, same revolving doors between government, academia, and defense contractors. Presidents change. These people often stay, or they rotate out and come back with the next administration. If you've ever felt like policy is on rails no matter who wins an election, this is why. Because the options have already been narrowed. The acceptable range of debate has been preset by people whose job is to define what's realistic and what's radical. Let me give you an example. The 2003 invasion of Iraq. You can debate whether it was right or wrong, but here's what's not debatable. The intellectual groundwork was laid years before in think tank papers, in op-eds, in working groups. By the time the public was asked to consider it, the machinery was already in motion. Ask yourself, how many major policy shifts actually surprised the expert class? Almost none, because they've already wargamed them. And if you think this kind of quiet intellectual architecture is abstract or historical, let me bring it into your living room. Because the newest generation of architects doesn't work in marble buildings or Pentagon annexes. They work in hoodies and build in code. And they're designing the empire you scroll inside every single day. If canals and railways were the skeleton and think tanks wrote the scripts, then today's architects are writing something deeper. The code that decides what you see, what you know, and what counts as real. Let me give you a name you might not know, Jeff Dean. He's a Google fellow, one of the lead engineers behind Google Search, Google Brain, TensorFlow. You've never voted for him. You've probably never heard of him. But his code influences billions of people every day, not through force, through architecture. When you search for something, an algorithm Jeff Dean helped build decides what you see first. Not a person, not an editor. Math, weighted rankings, machine learning models trained on billions of interactions. And here's the thing. An engineer you'll never meet can quietly change what millions believe is popular or true with one parameter tweak. This isn't science fiction. It's Tuesday. Think about YouTube's recommendation algorithm. Engineers adjust it constantly, sometimes to increase watch time, sometimes to reduce borderline content, sometimes to surface authoritative sources. Each tweak reshapes what millions of people encounter. Who decides what's authoritative? Not you, a team in Mountain View. Who decides what's borderline? Not elected officials, content policy teams and machine learning engineers. This is the new architecture of power, and it's almost completely invisible. Let me show you how deep this goes. Data centers. You probably don't think about them, but every photo you upload, every message you send, every video you watch, it's stored in a massive warehouse full of servers. Where are those warehouses? Who decides? Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta. They're building them in places with cheap electricity, favorable laws, tax incentives, and in doing so, they're shaping regional economies, energy grids, even geopolitics. When a country wants access to AWS or Google Cloud, that's leverage. That's soft power. And it's controlled not by the State Department, but by engineers and executives in Seattle and Silicon Valley. They're doing exactly what canal builders, Morgans, and Cold War strategists did, just at higher speed and lower visibility. And it's not just platforms, it's infrastructure you can't even see. Undersea internet cables, satellite constellations, the literally physical layer of the internet. Who owns those cables? Private companies. Who's launching satellites? SpaceX, Amazon, OneWeb. Elon Musk controls a satellite network that's been used in the Ukraine war. That's not hypothetical power. That's real geopolitical leverage in one person's hands. Have you ever stopped mid-scroll and realized this feed is not neutral? Someone built it this way. Someone decided that TikTok shows you an endless scroll. Someone decided that Twitter prioritizes engagement over accuracy. Someone decided that Instagram hides likes. Each choice nudges billions of people towards certain behaviors. And here's the existential part. You're both the user and the raw material. Every click, every pause, every scroll, it's data. It's used to train models, to optimize algorithms, to predict what you'll do next. You think you're using these platforms, but they're also using you to build better systems of influence. Are these engineers thinking of themselves as architects of American power? Probably not. Most of them think they're just optimizing engagement, improving user experience, solving technical problems. But intent doesn't matter. Effect matters. When a recommendation algorithm can shift elections, when a content moderation decision can silence movements, when a server outage can crash supply chains, that's power. Even if the person writing the code doesn't see it that way. The real question isn't who's president. It's who wrote the systems the president has to operate inside. Because here's the thing, presidents come and go. Platforms stay, algorithms stay, infrastructure stays. And the people building it, they're not in the history books yet, but they will be. If you want to see who's shaping the next 50 years, don't watch Congress. Watch GitHub. Watch the AI labs. Watch who's designing the next layer of infrastructure, because that's where the real decisions are being made. Just like they always have been. Subscribe to Golden History USA if this is the kind of story you want more of. Because we're not done. Now that you see the architects, let me show you the pattern one more time, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Canals and railroads, invisible engineers deciding where cities would rise, industrial titans, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, not just building industries, but owning entire systems, bureaucratic state, civil servants and statisticians encoding power into forms, agencies and regulations, think tanks and Cold War brains, intellectuals and strategists writing the doctrine before the public even sees the debate, digital infrastructure, coders, platform designers, satellite launchers building the empire behind your screen. Different eras, same dynamic, small groups quietly setting the constraints the rest of the nation lives inside. We obsess over presidents, elections, headlines, but the real leverage has always belonged to the people who design the systems underneath. And here's what that means for you. You are not powerless, but you are in danger if you don't even know these people exist. Because once you see the architects, you stop confusing the wallpaper for the structure. You stop thinking change happens only at the ballot box. You start asking, who's building the roads I have to drive on? Who's writing the algorithms I have to live inside? Who's designing the financial system my savings depend on? Those are the questions that matter. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who wants to understand how power actually works. Not the theater of it, the machinery. So here's what I need from you. First, subscribe to Golden History USA, because we're going deeper. Early central bankers, media barons, the people who designed the intelligent state, the infrastructure of surveillance, the money behind policy, all of it. Second, tell the algorithm this kind of content matters. Like this video. Leave a comment with which group of forgotten architects you want exposed next. The algorithm listens to engagement. Make it listen. Third, share this with one person who still thinks history is just dates and presidents. Because once you know who built the skeleton, every headline looks different. Every policy debate looks different. Every election looks different. You can't unsee it now. And that's the point. Because the moment you stop looking at the actors and start seeing the stage, the lighting, the script, that's when you start to understand where the real power sits. Not in speeches, not in photo ops, in the quiet decisions, the technical choices, the infrastructure, the code, in the hands of people you'll never see on the news. But now you know they're there.